Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. September 2019 marks the 75th anniversary of Operation Market Garden, the Allied attempt to create a 60-mile corridor and secure a crossing over the Rhine. The plan was to use the newly formed First Allied Airborne Army to seize and hold until relieved by the British Army's 30 Corps. The airborne component was known as Market and the ground attack was Garden. Joining me to talk about the background to airborne operations and Market Garden is Dr William Buckingham. Loyal listener, if you want a comprehensive breakdown and discussion of the operation, you need to pick up a copy of William's book, Arnhem. And for patrons of the podcast, I know I've already more of William and I chatting, so look out for that. If you're not already a patron, you can find out more at patreon.com/WW2podcast. The odd dollar also from you helps me find the time to put the show together, and I thank those who already support the show. William, your Arnhem book is comprehensive, but rather than pick through the blow-by-blow events of Operation Market Garden, I thought we'd go back to the beginning and start with the introduction of airborne warfare and how this might have shaped the operation. So let's start right at the back at the beginning. Some of the ideas that will be key to airborne warfare come out of World War I, resupply by air, those kind of things. So who was using this?
They were actually using aircraft for air resupply as early as 1916, the British, because they dropped some supplies into Kut in what's now Iraq. There's a force that was surrounded and whatever by the Turks, but they actually used it there, and they actually used it on the Western Front, particularly in the last year of the war, in Belgium, around Ypres and places like that. The civilian population was starving, and the Air Force, well, the RFC or RAF as it was then, they were actually dropping resupply ammunition and food to the troops, and then that morphed into a drop in supplies to keep the civilian population from starvation. So from that point of view, logistical side of it, then yeah, that was happening in the First World War. The actual idea of using airborne troops in the sense that, you know, is commonly understood now, was actually first raised by Churchill, believe it or not, in 1916. It didn't go anywhere, it was a theoretical idea, but he had this idea of raising what he called flying columns, which is large aircraft as they were starting to develop then, that would carry X amount of troops each, and you could land them behind enemy lines. Troops could disembark, and away they'd go. It never went anywhere in practical terms, but he did moot the idea in 1916 and put some detail into how it might have been done. The other big one occurred in 1918 and was on the American side of it, and that was when Billy Mitchell, the big American aviation pioneer guy, he mooted the idea of dropping the entire 1st Airborne Division behind Metz by parachute. And he drew up all sorts of weird and wonderful plans. Now, it was never a goer, not least because there simply weren't enough parachutes in existence to do that. Never mind having the aircraft, but nonetheless, this is quite considered the genesis of where the idea of what we now commonly understand as airborne forces came from.
It's funny because I don't think people really appreciate that this is all coming necessarily out of the First World War. And it's funny, the ideas are running ahead of the technology. It's a bit like Star Trek, where we're you know, Gene Roddenberry invented it, and when people are, there's an idea there, and then move towards it. So when someone comes up with a parachute, is it Irving that comes up with a parachute?
Yeah, Irving's company, yeah.
Irving Airshoot. I have an Irving Airshoot jacket.
Good for you.
It's actually too warm to wear. Is my only problem with it. We need colder winters. And now, how were they envisioning these troops to be used? Because I think for the Second World War, this potentially comes as the crux of the airborne. Are they expect them to be used en masse or coup de main, sort of surgical strikes, or as far back as the First World War, what was their idea of how they were using them?
I think the idea in the First World War was to use them en masse, which is largely how what you can call conventional airborne forces were employed in World War II. The idea was to put a large force behind the enemy lines and thereby cut the enemy off, or like force them to retreat, or do whatever happened to be done. That's why Billy Mitchell was talking about putting them behind Metz, because Metz was like a big fort, and going back to the 1800s, that was like a big fort complex that incidentally stopped Patton in the Second World War, stopped him cold when he was advancing to Germany. So that was the idea, to take that out. But the way it went, moving on slightly, the way it actually went was it actually used initially for imperial policing. And the first people to do it actually employ a fully trained and equipped and have a usable parachute force in the sense that we understand it today for conventional operations, if you want to put it that way, with the Italians. And they had a thing up and running by the end of the 1920s, about 1928, I think. But then theirs kind of like dropped away a wee bit when the guy in charge of it was killed in a parachuting accident. And that took the impetus away from it a wee bit. And then it was the Soviets that took up the mantle of it then. And they're the big unsung heroes, is the wrong word, but they're like the big unsung people that were pushing this stuff. The Germans copied them, I think. That's where the Germans took their idea from. I mean, they were dropping thousands of men by parachute, and they were using gliders to land heavy equipment. They had big specially designed aircraft for landing heavy equipment, and they were actually doing this stuff. They had big airborne manoeuvres, and I think it was 1935 and 1936. There's Pathé newsreel films of it, and it gives everybody a bit of a shock, because there they are dropping like 10,000 men in a lump in one place, all in one go, which was actually something to see. But then that kind of got nipped in the bud a bit by the Stalin's purges, because this stuff was all tied into Tukhachevsky and his ideas, what the Soviets called deep battle, and this is like really big stuff. If you were going to say invade the West from the Soviet Union, you would drop parachute troops all over the place. You'd have literally thousands of them on road junctions and major cities and river crossings and the whole 9 yards. And they tied this into this like massive concept of deep battle. It was like the spearhead of that. But as I say, that kind of went by the board. But because of the purges and Tukhachevsky being shot and all the rest of it, and then the torch then passed to the Germans. Now, your question there about, we're talking about using them en masse over surgical strikes, and the answer, as far as the Germans are concerned, it was both. And the Soviets as well, to a certain degree, because you can use that as a method, parachutes or maybe gliders, as a method of insertion for small sabotage parties or coup de main parties, to seize bridges or destroy installations, that kind of thing. And that kind of went off into like a separate strand into what we now call special forces. Whereas the conventional, if you want to put it that way, airborne forces, is conventionally trained troops who just get to the battlefield by a slightly different method and then do what they're going to do when they get there.
Although everyone seems to have cottoned on to the fact that they are still, even in this early period, they seem to be somehow classed as special forces, as men seem to be cherry-picked to go into the airborne rather than just taking all and sundry.
It's not so much cherry-picking. I mean, even back at the time, they did that initially with the British Airborne Forces, but they soon knocked that on the head because you couldn't get enough people. You simply couldn't get the numbers. They only managed to get like a battalion and a half when it was a commando and it was all volunteer. So what they turned to doing then, which is pretty much what everybody else does, they just took conventional infantry battalions, gave them all quite a rigorous medical, and if you were fit medically, then you were now a paratrooper, and then put the entire battalions through the training. And if you look at the records of the units that did that in the British Airborne Forces, definitely, then there's not a lot of difference between the original volunteer ones and the ones who were pressed men, you could say. It didn't really make any difference because they built up this ethos of being like an exclusive brotherhood and all the rest of it. I think it's tied in with the business about the selection is they have tests. Like at the minute the British Army do P Company. It's quite an odd test. It's turned into a bit of a fetish in its own right, but the idea of it was just say you got men who were fit enough mentally and physically to be able to do what you wanted them to do, because there is a little bit more involved in it from that angle than there is in being, say, a conventional infantryman. They'd argue with that, but that's not the case.
Oh, we've mentioned gliders, the preponderance of gliders. Did the Germans have a preference for gliders over parachutes? Because there's certainly, I was thinking some of the early, the Ebenholm is a glider operation, isn't it?
Yeah, the reason going for for gliders was because one of the problems, they soon identified one of the big problems with parachutes was scattering. If you ever look at film of guys going out of an aircraft, then paratroopers, then they get out of there fast. You know, they're like basically shoving each other out of the way to get out of the door. And the reason for that is that the closer the men get together out of the door, the less time they spend in the sky, and they come down in a tighter group. Well, the problem with that, as you see, even a tighter group is going to be spread over hundreds of yards, maybe more. And if there's any like kind of hang up and the blokes are getting out of the plane, then it's not so good. So they came up with the idea of the glider for different places for different reasons. I'll come back to that. But they came back to the idea because that would allow you to put down, you know, a squad of men or a platoon or whatever in one lump, in one location. So it was kind of a more efficient way of getting the men to the ground, you could say, at least, you know, from a purely landing point of view. However, the Germans went for it, I think, because of the Treaty of Versailles, they weren't allowed powered aircraft, and they got lots and lots of glider pilots and lots of glider expertise, which I think fed in to their preference for using gliders for this pinpoint accuracy business. The British actually went in for using gliders purely because the Air Ministry didn't want to provide any powered aircraft. Well, they didn't want anything to do with it at all, as I found in my PhD. They didn't want anything to do with that airborne force at all. They saw it as a needless deviation from their main task, which was bombing. And they certainly didn't want to put any big aircraft that way, so they came up with the idea of using gliders instead. And the reason they came up with the idea of using gliders instead is because the only people, obviously, that could fly a big aircraft like a glider would be bomber pilots, so therefore we need more bomber pilots in order to fly these gliders. And then, strangely enough, when it came to shove, and the Army said, well, can we have all these glider pilots? They didn't have any, so the Army had to train their own. The glider comes into the picture in the different airborne forces for the same reason, but for different underlying reasons, yeah?
Am I right in saying the Germans parachutists didn't initially jump with their weapons? They're followed separately. That's
right. Well, I was going to mention that actually to do with the Arnhem thing, because you know the Arnhem, you get all this stuff about Market Garden, it couldn't have been done and this and that. What actually happened was in 1940 the Germans actually did Market Garden in reverse, going from east to west rather than west to east. And the Eben Email thing you're talking about, that was a sabotage operation, well, a pinpoint operation. In order, because Eben Email overlooked the crossings over the Albert Canal that the conventional forces had to use. So they put those guys in there on top of that fort in order to destroy his guns and allow the passage of the main force. However, there were two other strands to the German thing in 1940, and they kind of get swept under the carpet while everybody worships the marvellous thing at Eben Email. Not taking that away from them, but what they did is capture a series of bridges over water crossings running from east to west across Holland, and this worked tolerably well. But one of the reasons where they did have problems was, as you said, it's flawed operating procedures. But I'll come back to that in a second. Yeah, they captured a load of bridges. Some of it was quite imaginative. In one instance, they landed some big Heinkel seaplanes on the river, carrying the troops, taxied them up to the bridges, and the blokes disembarked straight onto the bridges. That all worked tolerably well. And then, so when the armoured force came through across the Albert Canal and then across Holland, the bridges were there waiting for them to be used. However, the German thing, they had this pinpoint capability with the glider people, with the glider assault engineers. They had the parachute capability, and then they also had a big, what we call air landing, which is where you get, the Junker 52s, transport aircraft. Well, the idea was that you use, German doctrine, was that you use a force of parachute troops, and you drop them on an airfield, you capture the airfield, and then you can fly loads of conventional troops in using the transport aircraft. That was their modus operandi. Now, the thing at Eben Email worked, the thing capturing most of the bridges worked. It was a major failure when it came to capturing the airfields. Partly because wind scattered the troops, they didn't manage to capture the airfields, then the aircraft turn up on schedule and try and land and get shot to bits. They lost something like 400 transport aircraft across Western Holland because they were trying to land on motorways, in tulip fields, trying to put down anywhere they could. And a lot of the ones who tried to land on the airfields were shot to bits, and they had quite heavy casualties among the passengers as well. And this is it's a flawed operating idea, and it was further exacerbated going back to your original question, because because of the design of the German parachute, the troops couldn't carry anything except a pistol. Also, they couldn't steer the parachute because the risers went from the centre of the back, so basically just hanging face down, and you have to land on all fours. you couldn't carry anything in a situation like that. So what they used to do is drop the weapons, the rifles and machine guns and stuff, separately in containers. Of course, if the troops can't get to the container, then they've got no weapons. Not much use at all. And they were the things that defeated this idea of landing at Rotterdam and in the Hook of Holland and other places. They didn't learn anything either, because one of the big reasons for the Germans nearly failing at Crete the following year is because they followed the same flawed operating procedures, and it didn't work any better on Crete than it did in Holland. But anyway.
No, but perhaps they'd learned at Crete, because that was sort of the nail in the coffin for the German airborne...
Well, they did exactly the same things there. There was instances there of guys jumping and shoving the weapons behind the parachute harness, which pretty much guaranteed you were going to break some ribs when you hit the ground. But they were doing that and strapping ammunition to the legs rather than dropping without the weapons. But the problem was, of course, you can't do that with a rifle. Most of them were armed with rifles, so they still had to rely on this business with the containers and this idea of landing aircraft on airfields that weren't secured in time, with obvious results as we just discussed.
It's interesting that they do sort of the reverse for Case Red, the invasion of France and Belgium. So these bridge capture missions, they're very much for their pinpoint airborne missions rather than enormous drops.
The thing about it, I don't think anybody at the beginning actually thought it out for, well, we can use these for this and these for this, and there was kind of like all missions that they thought airborne troops could carry out. And this comes back to a little bit, I think we were talking about earlier about this, the overlap with special forces, because there was this idea that there was a variety of missions that you might need your people to achieve. So therefore, you had to have the calibre of personnel and training and equipment that would allow them to do this variety of operations. I think they would have made more use of the thing in France. It's just they didn't have enough. They used just about pretty much everything they'd got, because remember, they were still recovering in terms of aircraft and airborne personnel from what happened in Norway and Denmark. So they were still kind of like recovering from that when the advance into the west came up in May 1940.
If we then sort of skip forward to sort of Husky and Overlord, Italy, and Normandy, which are obviously big. The bigger their successes, but large numbers of airborne are used. Though it's very much the tenacity of the men that sort of scores successes at, my mind's just gone blank, where the gun battery that the British airborne take with almost no men, because
Merville.
Yes, the Merville battery, and then you've got huge successes, which is the surgical strike, where the gliders land within almost yards of Pegasus Bridge. Yeah, it struck me. I wonder if the Allies hadn't quite learnt that these vast drops that they were doing weren't necessarily as successful as they might be with the amount of troops involved. When we're sort of starting to think about they're creating this, is it after D-Day they create the First Allied Airborne Army, which is the American and the British area and the Polish area all lumped into one enormous force. I wondered if that was almost a slightly flawed idea from the start, to think of an army use of them rather than a smaller unit use of them, after their previous experiences and going back to what the Germans had been doing in sort of earlier part of the war.
I think, actually, you're kind of like conflating two things there. It's a logical conflation, but it's not accurate. The thing is that, just to backtrack a few paces, the Americans considered it, the airborne forces, they didn't go in for the glider thing, they didn't go in for the pinpoint mission thing. They were just like getting lots and lots of troops, a conventional division, if you will, and landing that by air on a certain area for an operational tactical reason. The British, however, had this thing with the raiding that came in, and that was why their approach to the thing was slightly different. However, the First Airborne Army was just, how can I put it, that was just an administrative thing. It was basically because the airborne force had grown that big. I mean, you've got 2 British divisions, 2 American divisions, but this is by the D-Day, and another American division forming in on it, which came over later in 1944. It was just, it needed an army-level HQ for administrative reasons in order to keep everything going together and get it all under one roof, if that makes sense. It wasn't really the idea they suddenly found they got all these troops, or we can use them as an army. They were using the troops in the way that they continue to use them, and the correct way, in my opinion. Before that, that was just like an administrative thing that they put in place in order to make training, operations and all the rest of it easier to conduct. You were talking there about the Normandy thing. In actual fact, if you go right back to 1940, in the immediate aftermath, and I mean within days of Dunkirk, the reason for forming a British Airborne Force was initially to spearhead an invasion of Western Europe again, to get us back onto the continent. These guys were thinking ahead. But even when really you might consider that wasn't maybe the best use of the time, and that's where the British idea of the thing came from, because they ended up with all these gliders and whatever that they designed, so they ended up putting conventional infantry units and all the rest of it into gliders, and then having conventional infantry battalions and brigades who dropped in by parachute for the big operations, as you were saying. However, the things that the Merville Battery, that was carried out, that was a parachute unit. That was a parachute battalion that did that. And the one at Pegasus Bridge, that was what the British called an air landing. That was a glider battalion that did that. These guys were trained to do conventional operations, but they were also able to seize pinpoint jobs and stuff like that as and when necessary. It was considered part of the job. But they weren't special forces or anything like that. They were just like battalions or companies from within the battalions or whatever that were told, yeah, you're going to be doing this is your job. And then when they'd finished doing it, they slotted back into their normal place within the battalion or brigade or regiment or whatever and carried on as normal.
If we look at that First Allied Airborne sort of army, the command is given to an airman. Is it Brereton? Why are they giving it to an airman, not necessarily? I mean, it would strike me as more relevant to either give it to an airborne commander, Ridgway, perhaps, or even an army commander who have more experience with troops on the ground, rather than an airman. As
I understand it, a lot of it was politics, and Brereton, they had to find a new job for him because of something else that had happened elsewhere. But actually putting an airman in charge makes sense from one point of view, for the simple reason, a lot of the thing with airborne operations is getting the troops on the ground, and that is an Air Force thing. I mean, it requires Air Force planning, it requires Air Force aircraft, personnel, all the rest of it. So from one point of view, it made sense to put an airman in charge. It might not have been the best idea. However, it worked better in the British system, because the British system was formed at the very beginning, and it dogged British airborne forces right through. And it's one of the problems there at Arnhem was that, as far as the British were concerned, their operating procedures was that the RAF were in total charge until the troops were on the ground. That meant that the troops had no input. The army had no input into what was going on, or how it was done, or the rest of it. Rather, there was no machinery to force the RAF to take the army's views into account. It was the RAF did the planning, and that's the way it went. So you could argue that the Brereton thing kind of fitted in with that. But at that level, it's more about politics than it is about operational stuff. I mean, the second in command of the First Allied Airborne Army was Browning, and Browning had no operational experience. He was a soldier, but he had absolutely no operational experience whatsoever, and he actually did more harm than good. The evidence shows, with his interfering and being involved in the market garden. So having a soldier in charge was by no means a guarantee that things were going to go swimmingly.
Well, yeah, but Boy Browning's obviously the big character for the British, and on the flip side is probably Matthew Ridgway for the Americans. But Ridgway had considerable airborne experience by the time of Market Garden. How did the two of them get on as characters?
They hated one another. They didn't get on at all. Most of the Americans didn't like Browning. I don't think most of the British airborne establishment liked Browning either. But Browning was an ex-guardsman. He was only brought into the airborne thing as an administrator because he was good at playing the Whitehall game. And that's why they put him in charge of it at the very beginning, purely to fight the airborne corner in Whitehall. But him being an inveterate schemer, he managed to take that and build his own like airborne fiefdom and turned everything airborne under his control, purely by using his bureaucratic infighting skills. And that's how he managed to get the second highest rung on the airborne ladder with absolutely no experience. That's why he went into Arnhem in order to address that. Because by the time that came up, his position was a bit precarious because he didn't get on with Brereton. And Brereton actually put him on notice to be sacked at one point. And then that was kind of like swept under the carpet because the operation was cancelled. But they didn't get on, and Ridgway was in the frame to take his place. Personally, from my reading of all the stuff I've looked at, is that the reason that Browning became involved with the business at Market Garden is that he was determined it had to go together at all costs because he was going to land there personally. And this was going to address his lack of airborne experience. When he first did the job, nobody had any experience. Everybody was new to the job. But by 1944, the middle of 44, there's no shortage of very experienced, very competent airborne commanders coming through. You mentioned Ridgway. There's Ridgway, there's Gavin, there's Maxwell. On the British side, there's Gale. There's people like this. So that was his way of shoring up his position as second to top dog in the old British Allied Airborne hierarchy.
He's such a fascinating character, Browning. He's now on my must find out more character list. I sort of wondered that if he hadn't been in Airborne and he'd been in say, he found himself in the desert, if he wouldn't have sort of come and gone rather quickly because of his slightly peculiar character, would have seen him he'd have got to the top quite quick, and then because it chewed up commanders who weren't quite as competent as they thought they were, he'd have been moved on.
The problem with Browning was his only combat experience was as platoon commander on the Western Front in the First World War. He's famous for that, and he's famous for riding his horse up the steps at Sandhurst. Apart from that, when they picked him for the job of fighting the airborne corner in the War Office, he was like in a low-level staff job at the War Office. That was it, and that was probably as far as he was ever going to go. That's why he seized this opportunity with both hands. He wasn't a field soldier and he wasn't a combat soldier, from what I can gather. What he was a bureaucrat, and he was good at playing that game. I mean, part of the reason they chose him to fight the corner is because he was a guardsman, and you should never underestimate the cachet that belonging to the Brigade of Guards brought to any job. Because you could call on that network and royalty and all the rest of it if he needed it, which I think is why he was so successful at building his little fiefdom. But I don't think he was the right person. I don't think he was the right man for the job because he didn't really achieve anything. Everything he did, from what I can see, was for the greater glory of Boy Browning. The thing is, he didn't really know what he was doing. This is quite a common thing about British Airborne Forces, particularly with the First Airborne and Market Garden. He actually materially interfered with Market Garden. You may well know this, I don't know, it's quite common. A guy called Urquhart, who was Brian Urquhart, Major, he was an intelligence specialist, and he spotted on some photographs from German tanks near Arnhem. Now, people blow this up as oh God, if they're only talk. We've never identified where those tanks came from, and if they came from the unit, I think they did, then they didn't play any part in what happened at Arnhem anyway. But, leaving that to one side, he took that to his boss, who took it to Browning, and the next thing the Urquhart guy knows is he's having a medical and being sent home with combat exhaustion and forbidden to talk about this to anybody. Yeah? Then you've got on the operational side of it, Browning, a couple of days, I think, before they took off for Arnhem, he just confiscated 38 gliders, most of them from the First Airborne's lift, and they were short of gliders for their infantry anyway, and he took away over 2/3 of a battalion worth of gliders to fly his personal HQ into the landing zones near Nijmegen with the 82nd Airborne Division. There's no need to do that. When he got there, he couldn't contact anybody because his radios didn't work, and he basically sat the entire battle, sat there not doing a great deal at all. On top of that, he's also responsible for the near failure of the Americans to capture the bridges at Nijmegen. Now, Gavin gets a lot of stick for this, because he says, he's planned to involve the bridges. The reason he didn't go for the bridges immediately, and the reason he scattered his men all around the Grosbeek Heights south of Nijmegen, was because he was specifically ordered by Browning not to go for the bridges until he captured all the high ground. And this gave him something like a ridiculous 60 square miles or something to defend with a single division before he was allowed to move on the bridges. Gavin was unfailingly it was probably, in my opinion, on the American side, he's probably the airborne commander par excellence. He commanded everything from platoon up to division, and he did it scrupulously well. I mean, at Arnhem, for example, at Market Garden, for example, when he landed, he did something to his back. So he was in extreme pain from the minute he landed, and he was running around, appearing at places, doing his men, and driving back and forth across his 60-odd miles with his Jeep, inspiring people. He was always there when it was necessary, all that kind of stuff. He was the man. He was ordered not to do this, and he tried to get around that thing because he's unfailingly correct and scrupulously polite. But what he did do, he ordered one of his men, one of his regimental commanders, to get people off to the bridge immediately. But he couldn't actually say that, so he couched it in terms of, you know, as soon as it's absolutely possible, get good, yeah? But unfortunately, the guy chose to do this. We want the sharpest tool in the pack. And he didn't act with the dispatch that he should have done. Later on, Gavin said he shouldn't have given it to him. He should have given this other guy who would have done it. As it was, when he found out 12 hours later the guy still hadn't moved on the bridge, he went flying up to his HQ and then kicked some arse. And they nearly reached the bridge. They're only about 100 yards away. They actually heard the Germans who stopped them unloading from trucks. And that was directly down to Browning's interference. So he nearly lost the whole shebang, as far as I'm concerned. He nearly lost the whole thing purely through his interference. He didn't need to be there. He had intelligence. He didn't need to be there, but he diverted scarce resources in order to be in a place where he didn't need to be. And on top of that, he actually interfered with matters that really he knew nothing about. As I put it in the book, it raised the interesting prospect of a man whose only experience was a platoon commander on the Western Front in the First World War, telling the most experienced and battle-tested airborne commander on the Allied side how to go about his business. That's what it boiled down to.
Market Garden, it comes the airborne after D-Day. They're sort of prepping continually for missions, and they're continually getting cancelled. They're sort of revved up and dropped off, revved up. Now, I'm right in saying Market Garden comes out of a mission called an operation called Comet. Is that right? What were the big differences between Comet and Market Garden? Could they literally just dust off Comet and change the operation name for Market Garden?
Well, that's what some of them did at Arnhem, and that's why it went wrong. But anyway, the thing about that, what you're talking about there is specific to the British First Airborne Division, because the 6th Airborne Division was sent into Normandy. They're the ones who pulled off the Merville Battery and all that stuff. The 2 American divisions fought in Normandy as well. They were pulled out, and then after no time flat, they were put back in for Market Garden. The thing you're talking about with the cancelled operations and all the rest of it, in the British First Airborne Division, and actually there were 15 operations that were mooted, started, and then cancelled. Some of them got further than others. I think on one occasion, if I remember correctly, don't quote me on this, they were actually like drawing parachutes and ready to go, and then it was cancelled. Other ones never got beyond the warning order stage. But yeah, there were 15 operations, and then the final one, as you said, was Comet, which is sometimes called number 15 in some of the official documentation, and that was basically Market Garden, but just using a single division, just using the 1st Airborne Division. So they were going to drop like a brigade at Eindhoven, brigade at Nijmegen, brigade at Arnhem, and that would have been it. But luckily, wiser heads prevailed, and they decided that actually, not least due to the Polish guy Sosabowski, because that was a ludicrously small force to try and accomplish anything with. The underlying reason for Market Garden was the German defeat in Normandy, because we surrounded the Germans after a couple of months fighting, surrounded them at Falaise, and destroyed the German army in the west, and then the rest of them went streaming off eastwards with the 30 Corps and the US army in pursuit. In a matter of days, they'd crossed northern France, and they were at Brussels, and then they were at by the beginning of September, they were on the Belgian border with Holland. Now, the problem you got then is that there was the Germans actually had, if you look at the materials and stuff, the Germans had nothing to stop a further Allied advance. But by the time they got to the Belgian border, things were starting to stiffen. And the Germans were leaping about like scolded cats, moving units in and doing this and that. But they managed to block the Guards Army Division there. But it was apparently still chaos, and there was still the Germans still didn't really have a lot to fight with. So the idea was to capitalise on this German collapse and precipitate retreat, was to advance into Holland and use these airborne troops that are like sitting there. I've heard one airborne commander described them as coins burning holes in people's pockets. But the idea was to deploy a 60-mile corridor of airborne troops running north from the Belgian border to Arnhem. And the idea, I can't remember the exact figures, I think it's something like 17 bridges over a dozen rivers or whatever, but that was the idea of it. And the idea of it was, A, to capitalise on the German disarray, and also to open the way into invading Germany from the north. Because if you went in anywhere else, you were going up against the Siegfried Line, whereas the Siegfried Line stopped near Arnhem. So therefore the idea was, if you could get across all those water crossings, then you could penetrate into North Germany, into the North German plain, without having to fight your way through fixed defences. That was the underlying idea of it. Of course, how they were going to do that, and where they were going to get the troops, and when they were going to do it, is another argument. But that was the underlying idea behind it.
So, yeah, I mean, you're dropping the troops in at 17 to capture 17 bridges, a 60-mile corridor, and the plan is to get 30 corps under General Horrocks, to up and relieve them. How much planning was involved between the airborne and Horrocks of 30 corps as to what was possible, what was needed, how they were going to do it, the logistics of the thing, or did the two not really talk?
They talked, but there wasn't a lot. The basic reason most people forget, I mean, you talked earlier about what they're going to, how they all concentrate on, they're doing at Arnhem. The basic reason it failed is because 30 Corps didn't get to where it should have been when it said it would. That's the basic problem. And there's a whole story to be told in that in itself, which is not airborne, but that's just down to a lack of application and a lack of push and not trying hard enough. And their primary documentation, you can see that. They started late every day. They stopped the minute it started to get dark. They stopped. There was actually an order saying no movement after darkness. Well, at that time, it was like 12 hours light, 12 hours dark. So you're losing 12 hours automatically out of every 24-hour period. Yeah, and so on and so forth. The coordination between the two, there wasn't a lot. To the point that, according to Horrocks, they didn't launch Operation Garden until the transports were going overhead, because they didn't know if it was going forward. Now that's actually fibs, because I've seen where the orders had been put forward and they'd been informed, and there's all kinds of reports and stuff. So they knew full well it was happening, and they knew full well when it was happening. For some reason, they just didn't bother to move until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It got dark at 6:30. So there was a lack of application on the part of the ground force in that particular instance, but there wasn't a lot of talking about between the ground force and the airborne force at all, really. There was some high-level planning and stuff like that, but I think the ground force in particular were quite ignorant of actually what airborne forces did, what the operations involved, and particularly the need for urgency. Planning from the airborne side of it, yeah, to say that they had to knock the thing together in a matter of days, then the actual planning was actually pretty good, depending on which unit you're looking at. The 2 American divisions were responsible for the vast majority of the crossings, and the First Airborne Division was responsible for like 3 crossings over a single water course. The problem you got with the First Airborne Division is that it was the least combat experienced of any of them. It had fought in Sicily, but it didn't fight as a division. It never fought a division. It used a glider brigade for one operation, it used a parachute brigade for another, and then it put the remaining 2 brigades, because they got slaughtered, both of them. They were involved in landing at Taranto, and then some on-foot operations in the early stages of the invasion of Italy. And then it came home with a really overinflated sense of its importance and capabilities that was noted by everybody, including the new commander of the division. And from there, it was born the idea that the First Airborne Division was the premier British airborne formation and the most battle experienced, when actually it was nothing of the kind. It only ever operated once in its entirety as a division, and that was in a 6-day exercise in the middle of May 1944. Apart from that, it never operated as a divisional entity at all. But nonetheless, they got the furthest away mission and the most difficult mission. Nobody seems to know exactly why. I mean, some of them think it's because it's to do with where the airfields in Britain relative to the objectives. Some people think it's with politics. I'd err towards the politics personally, but I've got no evidence for that. There is maybe Browning pulling the strings to make sure one of his formations got the top job, whatever it happens to be.
Well, it would seemingly be the one that had the most status, if they been the furthest bridge, presumably.
Yes.
The most difficult job.
Yes, absolutely. And that therefore begs the question, well, why did they send the least experienced unit to do it? But as I say, I'm not finished digging yet, but I've never really got to the bottom of that particular case.
It's always very hard to dig out underlying politics in someone's mind and not necessarily written down. He might have just had the idea, pushed it forward, no one questioned it, and you'll never find out why there was no discussion. It was just, okay, whatever, it doesn't really matter.
A lot of that at this particular period, you're absolutely right, I agree. And it's down to the way the British Army was run, because the top echelons of the Army, Montgomery, Horrocks, those kind of people, they didn't treat it like being in the Army, they treated it like being part of a club. So everything was done by conversations and him being the right chap and could you do me a favour. In actual fact, I think the reason that the Arnhem bit failed, yeah. Now, you get all kinds of stuff about this. There's the recurring myth, for example, that they landed on top of 2 SS Panzer divisions, which they didn't do anything of the kind. Well, those Panzer divisions, when they arrived in Holland, were totaled up less than a quarter of one Panzer division. They had virtually no equipment. And by the time Market Garden went ahead, one of them was on the other side of Arnhem, and the other one had sent most of its men back to Germany to be retrained and re-equipped, and the rest of them were about to get on the train. And none of those units, none of the elements from either of those divisions were between the landing zone and the objectives in Arnhem for at least 12 hours. So there was plenty of time to get there and back, but they didn't. Yeah. The other thing is that there was I tell a lie. There was a single German unit between the First Airborne Division's landing area and the objectives in Arnhem, and that was a SS replacement training battalion, which I'm not even going to try and pronounce the name, but it's generally known as Battalion Kraft, after the guy who commanded it, whose name was Kraft. Now, in a lot of accounts, Kraft gets the credit with holding up the entire First Airborne Division for the entire day after they landed, and then breaking contact after dark after doing his job. And he was a proper Nazi, and he wrote a very good self-serving report about how brilliant his men performed and how many thousands of British paratroopers his men killed, etc., etc. Problem is, it was all fiction. And if you go through the British War Diaries, which give you a literally hour-by-hour account of who did what and when, they fought 4 minor skirmishes. One of their elements was ambushed just off by the 2nd Parachute Battalion as it was leaving the landing area, and they wiped that one out. One of them attacked the tail end of the 3rd Battalion column, and the impact of that was far more serious than what it actually achieved. They fought a long-running skirmish on one edge of the landing area that didn't really make any difference, and they did ambush the 1st Airborne Reconnaissance Squadron's jeeps, and that gave them an excuse to abandon their mission after a firefight that went on for about 3 hours. But that's all those German units achieved. The way was open. I used to subscribe to the view that one of the reasons it failed was that it was 7 miles or more from the landing area to the objectives. But having dug into it further, there was simply nowhere closer to drop them. And the ones who got to the Arnhem Bridge got there in something like 3.5 hours. So it was perfectly doable. And the real reason that the 1st Airborne failed it failed, let's be right about it failed in the first 48 hours. I know the fight over there went on for 9 days, but they failed probably in the first 24 hours. And the reason for that was poor planning and leadership at the brigade and division level. That's the long and short of it. That's why it failed. Now, at the division level, that's because the guy in charge, Roy Urquhart, he didn't know anything about airborne operations. He was a Montgomery protégé, and he was given the job purely because Montgomery requested to Browning that they get a new division commander, because the original one was killed in Italy, and he was a bit of a clown as well, from what I can gather. But it came back without a division commander. They had a guy slated to replace him who would have been an excellent candidate, but he got sidelined because Montgomery asked Browning if he could find this guy a job. And Browning replied something along the lines of, yes, of course, providing he's hot from the battle. And that's how Urquhart was appointed commander of the 1st Airborne Division. He was congenitally airsick, for a start. He was congenitally airsick. He knew nothing about airborne operations. He got no background in it at all. He'd only commanded a brigade anyway, and he was landed with this job. Now, to be fair to him, I'm not suggesting he was incompetent or a bad officer. He just wasn't really of the right mindset to be an airborne commander. And you can see this in his planning, which is one of the roots of the failure. Because they didn't have enough aircraft to drop 3 divisions simultaneously, they had to deliver them over several days, and they gave priority to the first rung in the chain, which was the 101st Airborne, and then the 82nd Airborne got a bigger slice, and then the 1st Airborne Division, as the furthest away, they got the smallest slice of the resources, and this meant that the division had to be delivered over 3 days. Now that's fair enough. What the Americans did, though, because they didn't have enough to put all their people in one go either, but because they fought in Normandy, and the 82nd had also fought in Sicily and Italy, they knew what they were doing. And what they actually did is tailored their force in the first wave to the mission. So they put all their infantry in the first wave with just a few support elements and some artillery, and then the rest of the stuff can come later. Partly through things outside his control, i.e. the RAF planners. However, what Urquhart chose to do was get all his stuff on the ground in Arnhem first, and then get his train set all in one lump, and then move on his objectives. There was as many support elements in the first lift as there was infantry. So he sent one brigade off to capture the bridge, and the rest of them were to hold the landing area until the next day, when another parachute brigade came in, and then they were to reorganise, and then they were to all come together in one big lot and then move into Arnhem. Now, this is the Germans you're fighting here, and I don't really understand why anybody seriously thought that the Germans would sit on their hands for 48 hours while they got their act together and got moving. I can see sending the landing where they did, that's fine. I can see sending the brigade off to capture the bridges. They would have got away with that, with the element of surprise. There was no way they were going to have the element of surprise the next day, having sat there on the hands for 24 hours and waiting for the second lift to come in, and then moving, shepherding all the support units that they'd brought in on the first lift. It just wasn't going to work. And that's what actually happened, because the vast bulk of the 1st Airborne Division didn't get more than 3 miles from the landing area. They didn't even get as far as Oosterbeek before they were pinned down and surrounded. That's what happened. And that, I think, is purely down to Urquhart not really understanding what he was getting into. And there's more evidence to support the fact they didn't really understand what he was getting into. For example, it's pretty standard operational practice that when a unit's going into battle, any unit, they designate who's to be the take over if the commander's incapacitated, and they establish a proper chain of command. Who's next, who's second, who's third, who's fourth. Urquhart didn't even bother to do that until he was literally on the steps of his glider to take off. And his chief of staff says, "Oh, what happens if somebody happens to you? Oh, so-and-so can take over." Now, that should have been dealt with in the planning stages, because in airborne operations, there's no guarantee anybody is going to land where he's supposed to land due to enemy action, malfunctions, aircraft breaking down, whatever. Yeah? And he never bothered with that for a start. Really, I think it shows he not really got his head around the difference between airborne operations and conventional operations. And then when he was on the ground, he made a series of what can I describe as poor decisions that ended up with his division being left leaderless for the first 48 hours of the battle. He managed to get himself lost. I mean, he charged off from his HQ on the grounds of a baseless rumour to inform people of the baseless rumour, cut himself off from his HQ by retuning his radio, and then didn't return to his HQ when he had the chance. And then he managed to get himself cut off and trapped in an attic for 12 hours by a German tank, which obviously didn't know who was there. By the time he got back to his headquarters after 48 hours, it was too late. The deal was done. It failed. And it failed because there was nobody there at the helm in the vital hours when it could have been done. And there's other things as well. There's the overconfidence. There was the lack of push. The other thing with the poor planning and leadership was the leadership of the 1st Parachute Brigade, which was the ones who were supposed to leap off and capture the bridges. They were led by a guy called Gerald Lathbury. And his only airborne experience, he'd spent his entire time either at a war office or in administrative posts in airborne, apart from Sicily. And he commanded the 1st Parachute Brigade when they went into the Ponte Primosole, and that was a fiasco. And the fact it was a fiasco was down to them being scattered all over O's half acre and various things. But that camouflages the fact that his plan was trying to do too much with too little and overcomplicated. He had like 6 landing zones for a single brigade at night, and he gave them something like 4 or 5 different objectives and scattered them over 5 square miles instead of sitting on the bridge where they should have been. And he did exactly the same errors when he got to Arnhem, because he sent his brigade off, and really there were 3 bridges they were supposed to capture. There was a railway bridge, there was a pontoon bridge, and the main one was the road bridge. That was the important one. So the first Parachute Brigade was tasked to capture an area of high ground a couple of miles north of Arnhem. It was to capture the railway bridge. It was to capture the German HQ in the centre of Arnhem and several other places, and it was to capture the pontoon bridge and the road bridge. Now, that's a tall order for anything. That was spreading his people over about 7 different locations, all of which required at least a battalion minimum, probably more, to hold them, and he had 3 battalions. So if his plan had gone according to plan, then what would have happened is there would have been like companies of paratroopers and scattered all over Arnhem, and that was just a recipe for him to be surrounded and defeated in detail, which is actually what happened. Of course, the problem was that they never even got that far, because the guys who were going for the north, they were blocked by the German blocking line, and they tried until 1 o'clock in the morning, made repeat, lost over 100 men, and then headed for the bridge. The other thing that he suffered from was micromanagement. Now, to be fair, some of the micromanagement stuff might have been due to the fact that the 1st Parachute Brigade had an awful disciplinary record in the period running up to Arnhem. I mean, it ranged from, like, overstaying stuff, deliberate insubordination. They even, like, broke in and robbed the NAFI and stole all the money out of the NAFI bar at one point. It was really bad. So I think he may well have been micromanaging as a result of that. But his tendencies were that way anyway. And the thing was, he kept his people back on the landing zone for an hour when they could have been gone. And this is when time's supposed to be at the essence, while he too assembled all the bits of his train set. Then he turned them loose and spent his time motoring back and forth between them. He sent them off on 3 separate routes into Arnhem, which meant they couldn't mutually support one another. They had no contact with one another, and if anything happened to one of them, there's nothing they could do to help. And then he spent his time motoring back and forth between them, urging them to greater haste. By the time it was getting dark on the first day, he was virtually running the 3rd Battalion over the head of its commander and materially held them up because they were moving away from one of these German attacks. The Germans opened fire on the tail end of the column. I think, left to their own devices, the 3rd Battalion would have just carried on moving. But no, he insisted on ordering an attack that led to like a fight that lost about 40 blokes and lost 2 hours. And then on top of that, the division commander turned up in the middle of all this, looking for whoever he was looking for. And at that point, I think both men abdicated their commands, because what Lathbury did was he immediately ordered the 3rd Battalion to stop where it was instead of rushing off for the bridge and set in for the night. And the only reason I can find for him doing that really is to protect Urquhart. Now, they were only about 2 miles from Urquhart's HQ, so there's no reason why Urquhart couldn't have took an escort and gone back to his HQ, but he didn't. He stayed there for the night, totally cut off from his thing, no radio comms, no nothing. And then in the morning, they carried on moving towards Arnhem, and then you got this business where Urquhart got trapped in an attic, and Lathbury was badly wounded while they were doing it. The brigade commander took no further control. He actually got radio while they were sitting still in Oosterbeek. He got radioed by the guys at the bridge, Frostmen at the bridge. And the brigade major said, "It's clear, you need to come down here now." And he refused to move and said because the men were tired. And then, of course, while all this is going on, the Germans issued a warning order within an hour of the landing starting to get moving. They had no tanks, and they had a few armoured half-tracks, and a lot of instances they didn't actually have any transport. But nonetheless, most of them were on the move within 3 hours. And within 12 hours of the landing, they'd erected a blocking position across the top and in the outskirts of Arnhem. And then the rest of the time, the first Parachute Brigade, with a few reinforcements, fought themselves literally to destruction, trying to break through to the bridge. And then when they failed, they fell back to their main position where the rest of the division had finally arrived at Oosterbeek, and that's where they were surrounded. But that's why they didn't meet their objectives. It was poor planning and leadership at the brigade and division level.
Do you think, the apocryphal story of Boy Browning suggesting that it's perhaps a bridge too far, whether he did or did not say it, do you think it gets trooped out subsequently, because it almost deflects focus for failure away from the airborne and onto 30 Corps not being able to get there, and pushes the blame onto Horrocks not being able to whip 30 Corps along to relieve the bridges.
I'm not sure about the last bit, I'll come back to that, but yeah, it does get trotted out monotonous regularity. I've dug around, I've never found any evidence that he said it, because nobody was present at the meeting when he's supposed to have said it, except him and Montgomery. Montgomery, incidentally, is very reticent about this. And I think the reason, mostly, he's got more to say about his parting things and he's got to eat. But in this instance, he was very quiet about it. He accepted it was a failure. He took responsibility and he left it. And my personal take on that is because it's one of the few times he fought a battle where he didn't actually control it. And he didn't control it because he didn't know anything about airborne forces. He relied on Browning. He relied on Horrocks. And the problem with Horrocks, well, I don't know if you know this, he was actually wounded in the latter stages of the campaign in Tunisia, very badly wounded, and then he finally decided he wanted to come back and ask for a Corps command, but he wasn't well. He was a sick man. There's lots of evidence that when he was commanding 30 Corps during Market Garden, he was ill, very ill. He was having blackouts and all kinds of stuff. So the man in charge on the ground wasn't really up to the job, and that's why he didn't grip his division commanders like they needed gripping and make them do as they were told. But going back to the excuse thing, yeah, I've never found any evidence of it at all. Montgomery, I think, just kept quiet because he was badly let down, I think. It's the first time he relied on other people, and they badly let him down. I think that's why he's not saying anything about it. But the excuse, yes, they do trot it out monotonous regularity. I've not found any evidence that he actually said it. And even if he did, then if he thought they were going a bridge too far, then he should have been arguing to stop the operation altogether. Because without all the bridges, it made no sense. It was a failure. There was no point. I mean, some good did come out of it, because they used the bit that they had captured up to as far as Arnhem. They used that as a springboard when they pushed on through the Reichswald Forest up to the River Rhine, ready for the Rhine crossings in early 1945. There was some use came out of it. It wasn't a total write-off. But if he really thought that at the time, then he should have been arguing not to take the thing forward at all. The fact that he didn't argue that, to me, is down to the fact that he had so much personal prestige staked on it going ahead to cement his position in the airborne hierarchy.
So, the Airborne Army is created to do this type of mission, this large-scale, fulfill Monty's knife thrust into northwest Europe, or whatever the phrase quite was. Did they have a chance? Could it have been achievable?
Yes, I think so. And if only because it came so absolutely achingly close to working. A lot of it was luck, and all it would have took was for luck to just tilt the opposite way in one or two instances, and the whole thing would have worked. If you'd have had a better plan at Arnhem, they'd have got that bridge. If they'd have got more men to the bridge, they could have held it for longer. I mean, they held it for nearly twice as long as they're supposed to anyway, so that would have done it. The Americans, they did an excellent job. They got nearly all their bridges apart from the last two, the ones at Nijmegen. And then they fought like Trojans to get that, even though they were hamstrung a wee bit by 30 Corps, because the 30 Corps caught up by them. And I've got instances again of 30 Corps not wanting to fight because it was night. And the Americans have been a bit pissed off about this. Not the thing when they captured the bridge and refused to push on before that, when the actual fighting in Nijmegen. But it could have been done. Even though the bridge, the bridge down here on have got blown, yes, I think it could have been done. It came really, really close to it. It was a gamble worth taking, and they nearly pulled it off. They came so close to pulling it off.
Well, yeah, indeed, interesting. So I think we've had a pretty good go at Market Garden. So perhaps we should leave it there. If anyone listening wants to know more, William's book is Arnhem. I will, of course, put a link on the website. And don't forget, for patrons, there is a little bit extra for you. And to find out more about becoming a patron, head over to patreon.com/WW2podcast. I've got more Market Garden later in the month when I talk to Gene Metcalf, a veteran of the 82nd Airborne who jumped in around Nijmegen in 1944. His is an amazing story. But for now, that's all, folks. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.